William Roberts. I'm the Senior Vice President for Rights and Justice at the Center for American Progress. We're really happy to be back on the Vineyard along with our partners at the National Partnership for Women and Families and at the Aspen Institute for what's going to be a really interesting and insightful conversation about this moment that we're in. I don't have to tell anybody, I don't think, about the perilous place that we find ourselves, both from a community perspective, public policy perspective, and so we think it's really important to bring together these thought leaders to talk about the ways in which we are advancing Black economic success and stability in this moment, but also how we prepare for the future. I've had a lot of conversations with people, obviously, about things going on, and folks are sort of a bit in a defensive crouch. And we think the conversation we need to be having is about how we sustain through this moment, but also about how we're building for the future. So we're really, really excited to do that and to do that today. We're going to have a great conversation moderated by Jen White, who is the host of NPR's 1A. I feel like I know you, Jen, because I listen to you twice a day. And we should all be listening twice a day. We got to support public radio. That's a different conversation, but no less important. We have right next to you, Broderick Johnson. No, I'm sorry. Other way around, next to me, Broderick Johnson, who's there we go. Broderick Johnson, who's the Executive Vice President for Digital Opportunity at Comcast. Appreciate you being with us. Next to Broderick, Dr. Janelle Williams, who's the co-founder and CEO of Kindred Futures. Right in the middle, our friend Jocelyn Fry, who's the president of the National Partnership. And last but not least, Andre Perry, who is a senior fellow at Brookings and the director of the Center for Community Uplift. So we really appreciate you being with us. Excited for the conversation. I'll hand it over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Will, and thank you for the invitation. I just want to start with what I think is an important recognition of the moment we're in. The current administration has taken an aggressively hostile stance towards DEIA programs and policies, diversity, equity, inclusion, even though those policies and programs have benefited more than Black people. But as we're talking about solutions, what do we need to keep in mind? How do we continue to create space that acknowledges income disparity, health outcome disparity, continue to create that space while moving forward? And I'd love to hear each of you speak to that. Roger?
Sure, glad to. And let me apologize in advance because I have a hard stop at 2:40. So when I leave, it's not because I've been intimidated or I'm afraid or anything like that. We're nervous about what the Trump folks might think about what I have to say. Let me just say, in my role at Comcast, and I've been in that role for a little over 4 years, as the executive vice president for both public policy and digital opportunity. And the work, I would say, is even more important now in this sense, to go to solutions. We know that fundamental to economic success, educational success, financial success is both access and use of broadband, the internet. And so I spend a lot of my time really focused on going across the country to communities all across the country, urban, but also rural, talking to veterans and talking to folks from many different demographic groups about why it is so important that people understand that broadband is actually accessible to over 90% of people in our communities. The barriers, though, have to do with adoption. And so the focus of my advocacy is on addressing the barriers to adoption so people understand it's available, it's actually affordable in many ways, and it's relevant to how you can succeed and be upwardly mobile in this society. So focusing on those solutions of helping people understand how they can get a device, how they can develop the skills, and why it's relevant is so much a part of my work.
Janelle, I'd love to hear from you on this question of creating solutions while also acknowledging the reality of the outcomes for Black people that have often been disparate.
Firstly, I'm very excited to be here today, and I want to thank Aspen and all the partners for facilitating this timely conversation. I think that the political moment we are currently in actually simply magnifies enduring and stubborn inequities we've been wrestling with for decades. So when we look at the racial wealth divide in this country, while we've seen that Black wealth has increased by 66%, the dollar gap between white wealth, median white household wealth, and Black wealth is the highest it has ever been since the Federal Reserve started collecting this data. And so, again, this is enduring, stubborn challenges that we've experienced. My work at Kindred Futures is really focused on supporting a movement to build collective Black wealth. 56% of Black people in this country live in the American South, and we've run some analyses, and we found that a conservative estimate, 2 million Black households have zero negative net worth in the Deep South. 2 million. That is a significant number. So when we think about what are the opportunities, firstly, I think it's an invitation to explore how do we interrogate the way we define wealth? And there's an invitation for us to look at wealth as an interdisciplinary outcome. We've developed a structural determinants of Black wealth framework, which looks at the intersection of wealth through 4 core domains: finance, health, climate, and participation in a democracy. These things intersect in a deeply powerful and necessary, relevant way. We don't live our lives in these very discrete boxes, right? I am a mother, I am a worker, I'm a daughter. And so when you think about wealth, we really have to think about how these systems interact to create the outcomes we're seeing. We're also looking at an invitation around how do we scale community wealth building models? Because it's really important to divorce density from collective outcomes. And I'll say this, like, I live in Atlanta. Atlanta has one of the highest densities of Black millionaires, and yet we lead in economic immobility. And if you go further to disaggregate those outcomes, we see it's actually Black people on the South Side that are locked in the lowest quintile around paths to opportunity. And so for us, it's like, how do we look at community wealth building models? And so we're investing very heavily in looking at our current businesses. We are getting ready to see several baby boomers retire, and there's an opportunity to think about this intergenerational wealth transfer and what it means around converting some existing businesses to co-ops, to shared owned business models. We also think there's an opportunity to really think about thoughtfully scaling Black businesses, particularly in high growth industries. Black businesses contribute $200 billion annually to our economy. They produce 3.5 million jobs. And if they actually received parity access to capital, they would actually be able to produce 13 trillion to the GDP by 2050. So just want to name that.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the investment in Black businesses. We'll circle back to that. But Jocelyn, I want to get your thoughts.
Sure, thank you so much. And I will sort of pick up, I think, a little bit where Janelle left off. And I think, one of the things that's most important for us to recognize is that the premise that this administration is starting with is not right. Right, like the status quo was never built for us to be successful. So a lot of the work around DEIA, as I know that we all know, was an effort to correct something that was flawed from the start, right? So I think you have to start there. Then you have to talk about what is a vision for the future, right? Like a lot of people don't just want to be against something, they want to be for something. And when you talk about women, you immediately talk about what are the pillars that were really essential for women to be able to, be autonomous, to direct their own lives, to make decisions for themselves. And a lot of the progress that we have seen over decades was really rooted in those very fundamental principles, whether it was the ability to control your own body, right? Whether it's the ability to go into the economy and choose jobs that you want. Like all of those advancements that were often based on some notion around diversity, equity, and inclusion were really, in many ways, sort of efforts to make our democracy actually more meaningful and real for all people. And so I think we have to continue to claim that in a moment when this administration is trying very hard to sort of use a narrative that is, inaccurate and inflammatory to try to say that they're standing for something that we know is very contrary to what we say we aspire to. Right. And we have to be unapologetic about that. The thing that I've said to folks is that this is a moment not to pull back, it is to lean in. Right. Like don't run from diversity because we know that it's so critical to our ability to actually achieve a number of goals that we say we believe in. So that's critical for women in particular. If we're not talking about, equity in the workplace, then we're not going to create a country where women can be successful. So that's how I start.
Andre, what about for you?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on this false premise. One, that wealth building in general is not a zero-sum game. And the way this administration has framed it is that if you give to one group, you're taking away from another. We did a study not that long ago where we did look at the well-being of Black folk compared to the well-being of white people. What's fascinating, when you invest in anyone in the lowest wealth quintile, the well-being of every group improves. That is very particular for Black people. When you invest in Black people, the well-being of white people improves. Now, this is where I've always believed in having more specificity. My son should not get a program, an initiative, a grant. I believe that just based on the lineage that he has to me and my family, I do believe we do need some filters that will allow for whoever's disadvantaged to receive certain federal, state benefits. I agree with that. And I also agree that we need to be very clear that if we don't invest in low wealth, low income people, this whole house of cards can collapse. So for me, it is to break this idea that we're in this zero-sum game. And that if you give to one group, you're taking away from another. No, if you do not invest in many Americans, everyone's quality of life can collapse very quickly.
Roderick, I want to take advantage of your time while we have you, because the economic environment is shifting so rapidly around us. Whether you're talking about the U.S.'s shift in trading relations, or we're talking about the Trump administration's push on cryptocurrency. But artificial intelligence comes up in almost every single conversation I have. How it's going to reshape the workforce. Where are both the risks and opportunities for Black people, especially around this question of wealth building and access to opportunity?
Sure. So first, with regard to risks, the risks, of course, are around misinformation, disinformation, making what's true false and what's false true. So all of that, of course, is part of the risks around AI. A bigger risk, I think, is if we don't make sure that our young people are learning and becoming skilled at AI as early in their lives as possible, because it's not going away.
Okay, can I ask, but what does it mean to be skilled in AI? Because people use ChatGPT and these other bots and probably feel quite skilled, but what does that mean?
So, I'll give an example. It was, I get to go around the country and see all these inspiring programs with different partners. So Comcast is working with Dell to support an AI program in West Philadelphia, where there are 36 young people of color, high school age, who are learning about AI, how to use it, what it means, but also to go to wealth building, the economic, power behind AI. And if they can learn and become skilled at it, they can become successful entrepreneurs. So it's like, don't teach them to sort of, shy away from AI, but learn how to embrace it and use it.
Is there any concern that the pace of that technology, the way it's developing and expanding into our lives, isn't keeping up with the regulatory environment nor the ethical discussions about how it is used.
So, in the broader context of technology, regulatory and legislative efforts to sort of manage it, so to speak, have almost always trailed behind the technology. That's happening in AI, but to a lesser degree because there's more of an overall embrace by legislators around AI, right? The people in state legislatures and attorneys general want to learn about it. So I think it's not as bad as it was when, say, the internet came along and there were members of Congress who were talking about pipes,
Right.
for example, right? Internet pipes.
Yeah.
But so, yes, there is a regulatory environment that is very different and very aggressive. But again, we talk about the digital divide. I talk about it all the time, right? And we talk about things like, well, we need to help close the digital divide and get computers to kids and all this. It's so much more important that we see AI as the next potential. It is a digital divide now. Let's catch up as rapidly as we can, but then get ahead of that because we are always working from behind.
Well, let's turn to this question of working from behind, because when we talk about wealth building in the Black community, that's really happened through two pathways: homeownership and then retirement savings. And Janelle, we know even now, Black folks are behind in both of those spaces. So where are the opportunities for both financial growth and financial literacy, but also providing opportunities for people to be homeowners, to grow their retirement savings, and perhaps even think about the approach to that in a different way? I think we take very individualistic approaches to wealth building. Where are the opportunities now?
Yes, I think it is both and. As we think about wealth building, and we have an opportunity to explore multiple streams to build collective wealth. And I will continue to emphasize the collective wealth because it is critical to protect our freedom. And so when we think about the opportunities, I think there are several, and I'll focus on two in the interest of time: structural and then the investment. I do believe we have to invest in policies that redistribute wealth, where there's opportunities for people who have been locked out of the economic mainstream. And when we actually interrogate particularly state policies, and when you look at higher education programs in particular, the policies that are on the books, they actually support white, wealthier households, and they are primary beneficiaries of this. So I think it's important that we really interrogate our policies, particularly at a state and local level, and in this time, that's deeply punctuated. I think when we're looking at some of these pieces too, we're looking at baby bonds, and there is a growing momentum around baby bonds. Now, people have different terms that they're using. We've moved baby bonds into House Study Committee for Georgia legislature, and a Republican legislature said, we've had this surplus this year. Let's look at some child savings accounts, right? And so we know, and we've done the analysis, if we in fact do a hybrid baby bonds program in the state of Georgia, it will contribute $2 trillion to low wealth families. And so really looking at policies that can redistribute wealth is incredibly important. We also...
I just want to really quickly bring in Jocelyn here, because it's when we talk about policies that redistribute wealth, what I often see happen is the data that you shared, right, bump up against a narrative about poverty, low-income families, what they need to grow wealth. And so from how, Jocelyn, do you turn the data into a narrative that can help combat some of the aggressive regression we're seeing around policies like what was just described?
I think you have to do a couple things. One is you have to be clear about what you think the problem is and what you're trying to solve for. And so even a policy that I think is a good policy around baby bonds, if you think about how the president has used that terminology, He uses it as a solution for why women shouldn't work and why you don't have to do a range of things, right, over the course of folks' lives. So I think it is important, at the same time you're talking about specific solutions, to be clear that you need a multifaceted approach to solving problems that are complicated, right? And you can't sort of say it's a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't say it's only one, paid leave is not the same as childcare. One isn't a substitute for the other. You have to give a thoughtful, holistic response to what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and then, pivot and say, and here's the way to get there. I'm all for, and I think the data is powerful. I think one of the challenges we're meeting at the moment is a resistance to data. And an interest in not looking at data. The data tells us a lot about solutions. If you look at data around just looking at Black women, and I agree with Andre that, I often say, and, you can solve a whole bunch of problems if you just solve Black women's problems, right? If you just solve, Latinas' problems, because you're solving a lot of things. And when you look at things like the racial wealth gap and the racial and gender wealth gap, you see a couple of things. You see a lot around pay disparities. And we know that the wage gap is driven not only by discrimination, but also the lack of strong work-family policies, occupational segregation. So you have to address all of those things if you're really trying to not simply address one particular problem, but really talking about how do you move people forward, right? The last thing I would say is in Black families, Black moms, 80% of Black moms are breadwinners. They're either sole, primary breadwinners. So that tells you right away that if Black women aren't working in workplaces that are fair and paying them fairly, it affects their families. It's a lifelong set of investments we need.
Roderick, I know you have to leave, but before you do, I love ending sessions like this, not with an answer, but with a question you want us to consider as we leave this conversation. So drawing from your experience and expertise as we're thinking about how to take what we hear here back to our own communities, what is a question you want us to ask ourselves?
Oh, geez.
I know.
If I think about that, then I'll have to leave before I can give you an answer. By the way, the reason I have to leave is Eric Holder and I are attending an event. I'm sort of his paralegal today, so.
That's a good excuse.
In terms of a question, I don't know. So let me finish though with this, data, the importance of data. So, I know from common sense, we all have changed the way we do financial transactions. I don't remember the last time I went and stood in a bank line and waited to deposit a check. And knowing there are many people in communities like I grew up in Baltimore where people are still getting on a bus, going across town to deposit a paycheck rather than just taking a picture.
Yeah.
Time, money, stress, right? So we sort of know that example. Millions and millions of people are still stuck sort of in that paradigm. It's not a paradigm, that scenario. So we did research, we commissioned research at Comcast along with the Urban Institute and Boston Consulting Group, to sort of look at how many people really will be able to help provide the data. I'm not putting this as articulately as I should, but in other words, survey people who've used the internet who can say that it has saved them time and money. And we came up with resounding numbers of surveyors who said, yes, because I'm on the internet now, I don't have to go to the bank anymore. I can shop, right? Comparison shopping and save money, all those things. But then go to a different view of how you start to create wealth. It's all relative, but at least it starts to build the case of people saving more money and being able to use their money more effectively. And so my question would be, how do we make sure that story gets told?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Roderick, thank you.
Nice to see y'all. Thanks. Great to be on this panel.
Can I pick up a little bit on
Yes,
the
please.
data question? Most people know me through my work on housing devaluation, where we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there's about 156 billion in lost equity across the country. Now, while that was an important stat or stats, you have to understand the rhetorical power of numbers. When people could see that their assets are much more valuable than they are priced, they began to rally around that idea. We need to also just have a very asset framed approach to our solution. Too often, we look at disparity, and while that is important from a statistical point, it often leaves us with Black people need to catch up with white people in order for there to be equity. That number, I always do this, that 156 billion is the equivalent of more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based upon the average amount Black people use to start their firms, would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education, would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It would have covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage. It's it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis, a big number. I say this like it keeps my teeth white, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. We have to remember that there are systems in place that are devaluing us. And it's not the homes that are being devalued, it's the people that are being devalued. And this on a point, I always bring this up because financial literacy, education always come up. From empirically, education doesn't predict for wealth, wealth predicts for education. So we have a lot of financial literacy programs, and trust me, we all need to be financial literate. I believe in that. But it helps when you have an asset. When you have a home, when you have a bank account, when you have some kind of foundation for wealth building. So I'll leave it there, but it's how we use research. Yes, I'm at a think tank. We provide research for policy, but we also need to be mindful of the rhetorical power of these numbers. And will they be used to rally people in a way that humanizes them? And that's what I try to do with my work.
You used to look like you want to jump in here, Jocelyn.
Well, I completely agree, and I think it goes back to where we started, which is it's why this administration is trying so hard to get rid of numbers, right? And it's leaning into a narrative that is wholly focused on devaluing mostly Black folks. Saying, equating diversity, equity, and inclusion with something that is inherently problematic, right? Because they understand both the power of that narrative, and if they can sustain that narrative, they don't either have to collect data, or they don't have to pay attention to data, or they can rationalize it away in some other, other sorts of description. So I think it is incumbent upon us to be really rigorous and clear that the data can be so powerful. But we also, I appreciate what you're saying, sort of claim it for not rationalizing a narrative that always puts us last, right? Like we often, sort of believe and live with this notion that we are somehow less than. Because we're used to people devaluing our work, right? Like, this is the history of Black people. It's the history of Black women workers, is that much of the work that they did, from the moment, as I say, they were working from the moment their feet hit the shores of this country. But to hear other people tell it, it's all, they have a bad work ethic and so have you. They were doing care and domestic labor for no money or little money, right? And I think that legacy is something that we still have to overcome consistently. So I think, 1,000%, agree with Andre and Janelle. We have the power to have a different narrative, but we have to be clear and own that narrative.
Yeah.
I want to get on this point as well, because I think we don't have data to fully comprehensively define the nuance of Blackness. And so I think it's important, as we're talking about data, to also talk about the fact that it's not there by design. And so even as we're having a conversation around wealth, how is wealth defined? Who defines wealth? Who has the power to assess the progress, the baseline? These are real legitimate questions we need to wrestle with. So I want to name that. I also think in terms of the relationship between data and narrative, it is so important because the way data has been historically used is to romanticize resiliency. And Black women have been disproportionately used as the martyr of this resilience. And so it's very important that we do think about who holds the data, how the data is defined, and the reality is we've not really scratched the surface to assess, what we actually do practice here around collective wealth and co-op economics. These are emerging concepts, and we are using tools from systems that had designed to exclude us. And so there's an opportunity for us to, I really talk about being arsonists and architects. And there are things that we actually do need to burn to the ground. They're not working. They're not designed to work for us. And there are things we need to reimagine and rebuild, and we're at a crossroads for that now.
Well, let's talk about the reimagining and the rebuilding, because what I hear very clearly from people in my personal circle and just from listeners is at once a deep frustration, but also a deep feeling of disempowerment. They feel like their elected officials aren't listening to them. They feel increasingly disconnected from community. There's almost like a cocooning happening. So what do we do is the question, right? What is the first layer of foundation that we need to lay down to create these new models and these new systems that maybe aren't always about investing here in the US? Maybe it's about looking outside of the US for opportunity.
Well, I'll pick up a few of the things you laid down in terms of, I do believe we need a hyper-local approach to this work, not just because of the current environment, but we do need to have a sort of a community development approach to building. This is a policy talk, so I will say, I'm a big believer in special purpose credit programs. These are programs that allow financial institutions to change their underwriting practices so that they can offer new products to people who their grandfather didn't own a home, so they didn't get an intergenerational wealth transfer.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Is there an appetite for that right now? We've seen so many.
Oh, yeah. So, I will say this,
Okay.
that how I would frame it is home ownership. Talk about owning a home. It is still one of the top things people look for. And they feel that it's out of reach. If you can give them a product, and this is something that, on the national level, I do believe that our national leaders are very disconnected on both parties. They are listening to either a Democratic or Republican agenda, and that trickles all the way down to our city leaders, our municipal leaders. And in many cases, if I'm in Alabama, guess what? They want child care. They want things. If you're in DC, our policing language needs to shift. So my point is, though, that we do need to go local and give people what they need and want.
So when I said, is there an appetite, I meant in the private sector. Is there an appetite in this moment to say, you know what, let's maybe we've got to work around some language in a particular way,
Yeah.
but let's make these new
Yes.
programs. That's what I meant.
Now, Trump did eliminate special purpose credit programs from Freddie and Fannie, but you can still do it at local level. CDFIs, community banks, there's appetite for it. Because we've learned during the pandemic especially that these community-facing banks were letting out loans, and they were great loans. They were great products. They're getting great return. In many of these cases, they outperform, mainstream traditional mortgages and business loans. So CDFIs want to go to ground and do these things. It's not just CDFIs. I'll include other community banks, credit unions, and the like. But I do believe we have to start local. We have to focus on housing. I'm a big housing. But one other thing I will mention: commercial real estate. 80% of all commercial real estate is owned by 1% of families, right? Now, why is that important? Because about 43% of all wealth generated from real estate comes from the commercial side. I can go to any commercial corridor, and there's about 3 people that own that block. Getting to the collective and cooperatives, we do need to buy back the block together. And there's capacity for it. The SEC approved this various crowdfunding platforms, whereas people with as little as $1,000 can invest in a commercial real estate product. I follow a guy by the name of Lanier Richardson. He buys these Morbin strip malls, one in Baltimore, Chicago, other places. And then he goes literally door to door asking residents, do you want to invest in this? Why this is important in Baltimore? Redlining started in Baltimore. And it is in an area that there was racial covenants all around. So for local residents, the descendants of formerly enslaved, to now own property, it means something different. It hits different.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm a big ownership person, home ownership, going back to 40 acres and a mule, can understand that you control the means of production on the land that you own.
So go local, but
Go
it
local.
may require a new model of collective ownership rather than individual ownership. Jocelyn, for you, what is that first layer of foundation we need to lay?
Well, I guess I would start slightly differently in the sense that I think a lot of the solutions that we have are solutions that people agree with, from a women's perspective, fairness in the workplace, access to work family supports, support for caregiving, mostly because women are disproportionately ones who are doing caregiving, like all those things people support. So, and there's both good examples domestically and internationally of them working. We don't even have to look that far. So I think, you can certainly articulate to people there are solutions that work and are effective. I think in this moment, though, the other thing I would say is that many of the things that we've talked about, access to education, home ownership, we haven't talked so much about, federal government jobs, but when you look at how Black folks moved into the middle class, those are the ways that they did so. I think about my parents were federal government workers, for 30 plus years. And that's how many Black folks did it. So I think what this moment has to focus on is the fact many of those pathways are now being intentionally eroded, right? Whether you talk about education or housing, and certainly the federal workforce and so forth. So I think it is not only about articulating solutions that we know can work because they have worked. It is also about building a narrative that talks about the tactics that are being deployed to undermine those strategies is not only harmful for Black people, but for everybody, right?
Let me ask you this, because we're in a media environment where people can self-select their own information bubbles. They can shape whatever reality they want. There is little to no accountability for the spread of mis and disinformation. Reaching people where they are to not just shape, but to share the narrative you're describing. As someone who is in media, my God, it is incredibly difficult right now, incredibly difficult. So I know you're not in media, you don't work in the media, but where do you see the opportunities to, is it about going into community? Is it about being more on the ground in communities to help share that narrative?
Yes, but I also think people at the end of the day know what they know personally. They know if the gas is too high, if the eggs are too high. Like they know, very much sort of their own cost of living, if things are tougher. And that's true for a lot of people across race. So I think, the thing that I keep reminding myself of is that outside of the DC bubble or outside of the policy bubble, most people don't care about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're just trying to, make it, get their kids to school and make sure their parents are okay, like the basics. And so I think you have to speak at that level and use all the different sources possible to try to break through. It is, I wish I had the answer because I don't have a perfect answer. But the thing that I do know is that people, at least when it comes to voting, they will vote for what they think is in their economic interest, right? Like every election is about the economy, period, the end, right? So if they think that they're not going to be able to get a job, if they think their kids can't, support themselves, like if they see it in real time and they feel it, then they will be concerned about it. There's a reason why that big crazy bill, they pushed out a lot of the effects until after
After the
November
midterms,
26th.
yeah.
This is not rocket science. They know this too. So, for all of our talk and all of the things, at the end of the day, it breaks through not because somebody told them in the media. It breaks through because when they went to buy the car, it was $10,000 more than it used to be, right? Like you can't change what people are experiencing day to day. It's sort of the challenge. I know that they know well, during the previous administration when everybody kept saying the economy's okay. Like people were like, it's not okay if my eggs are $10, right? So I think that we have to remember that at the end of the day, people are experiencing the economy in a certain way, notwithstanding what we say. It doesn't really matter if the president says it's a great economy if unemployment has gone up and, double. Like people will live it a certain way. And what's important for us is to make sure that we're lifting that up as much as possible.
So,
This just one only challenge to that. I do. People clearly will vote on sexism and racism also, right? The price of eggs didn't, it really, at the end of the day, wasn't the thing. It was also, they did not want Kamala Harris in office, many people. And also, I realize this in DC. There's a lot of people who are willing to take authoritarianism as a solution. And so I only said that to say that there are other things that we have got to address besides the economy. That this narrative thing is real. These stories that become this part of our gravity of understanding, we've got to have better stories out there. And that's why we do need to work with the artisans, the movie makers, filmmakers, because as someone who works with numbers all day long and talk about the economy, there are some things that people will vote just to be spiteful to another group. And we see it, we live it, and it's like, man, how do we change that? But in the main, it's right. But sexism and racism is a real substantive interest for a lot of people.
And Janelle, I just want to note here that we're going to go to questions after your answer, and we'll have about roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Go ahead.
okay. I think what's really foundational is for us, remember the construct of arsonists and architects. we need to burn the echo chamber. I think that we have very intellectual conversations and even debates, and people are struggling to figure out which bill gets paid and when. And I work in the deep South. And when I go into Mississippi, when I go into Gee's Bend, when I go into these places, people do not feel seen. They do not feel heard. There is a lot of DC talk that is, quite frankly, very disconnected. And so some of the things we have to root out to burn the echo chamber is some exceptionalism. As a community, we have to unpack that. I think we really, and this is why it's so important, because several of the tools that Andre referenced, CDFIs, credit unions, community lenders are outperforming traditional institutions. But when you looked at, I was leading small business at the Atlanta Fed during COVID, and when we looked at who was actually being able to get these loans, we saw small businesses of color, they were using CDFIs at like a 2 to 4%. 2 to 4%, they were all going to mainstream lenders. So you can have valuable tools and resources, but if people are oblivious to it, it's not going to work, right? We have to really think about how are we leveraging spaces that are created already to bring messages to people in a very concrete, actionable way. You know, my dad works in manufacturing. He's a technician. And every day he checks in and he's tracking what's going on in DC. He's tracking everything. And I will say, Dad, you know what? This is what I'm thinking about the next phase of the work. And he simply responds, that makes no sense, Janelle. And when he says, that didn't make no sense, I leave it alone because he breaks it down. It seems really practical. In my mind, it's very, a wonderful idea, but it doesn't work. And we've lost our way to sense making. And so we really have, the first thing we need to do foundationally is to break the echo chamber, burn the echo chamber to the ground. Last thing I want to say is also, when we think about organizing, I'm so glad Melanie is in the room. When we think about organizing, so many times we look at it around political. It's like a political act. We need to really marry political and economic organizing, which we've done in the past, but it's really important. You reference I agree with hyperlocal. I agree with really looking at place-based solutions, and let's not cream the places. We need investments in the Deep South. Less than 3% of philanthropic funding is coming into the Deep South, where 56% of Black people live. We need support in the South, but we also have to organize our resources strategically. How we build wealth matters. I don't want my portfolios to represent investing in private prisons, right? And I also know Africa is the fastest growing market right now. Its profit margins for businesses only compete with Asia. That's a window there for us. So I think there's an opportunity for us to invest differently with what we have and make sure we invest in local places that are the hardest places if we want to move the needle.
And we'll go to questions now. I just want to add, there is a wealth of experience, expertise, and relationships that are being let go by the federal government. Yes. There are lots of Black folks who worked in Africa. Yes. Those relationships are invaluable when it comes to building business. So there is an opportunity there to swoop up those federal workers and to... Assets. Yes, they're assets. They're assets. So we should not just assume that they'll find a place in the private sector. And in fact, that is probably not the place we want them to go. Those are some of our most powerful assets right now, and we should not leave them by the wayside. Questions?
First of all, thank you for your comments. I just want to maybe double click on a couple of them. I'm Priscilla Brown, Amalgamated Bank. My colleague here is Sabrina Stratton from the bank. And so we think a lot about the point you were making around CDFIs and local community banks and other institutions. And it feels to me, and this is a comment, but it feels to me that everyone needs to leave the room with an action item. Mm-hmm. And when you invest in those CDFIs and smaller financial institutions in your communities, you really are taking action, because that is who's going to turn those that capital around and make it available to the small businesses in our community. And I feel like that message, which I heard you hint at, I would love to hear us double click on, because I think that is the one thing we can leave this island committed to do, and everybody has the ability to do that.
Just briefly, we used to have big conversations about anchor institutions like 20, 30 years ago. We need to go back to that language of anchor institutions. Our banks, our schools, our hospitals, these are life-saving institutions. And the fact of the matter is that Black communities are losing banks at a faster rate than other places. So for me, it is about sourcing and investing in these anchor institutions that is critical to uplift.
Can I just add one point?
Sure.
It's so powerful. There are 149 minority depository institutions. There are almost 1,500 CDFIs. There are only 22 Black banks. Yes. And none of them are very much over $1 billion. You got City First and Liberty that are hovering slightly over $1 billion. All the rest are very small. Solvency is not, there's no relationship between solvency and size. The larger bank is not more solvent or more safe. That's right. So it is in everyone's best interest to think about those.
Yeah. Other questions? Right here.
I really love what you had to say about the coupling of political and economic power. I think people don't know what that means or how to do that, because for so many people who are, like you said, cocooning, because it may not be safe to be out in the streets or whatever, people are wanting something to do that's activism. And so who is sharing that content? I think even just knowing who those folks are, so we can be spreading the word, because I think that is a form of activism that people are looking for.
I think there's a lot happening in this space, and they are led by Black women. I work in the South, and a lot of what's happening when Georgia flipped, that was 15 years of work, right? And so right now we're having conversations with Win with Black Women. What is the economic arm, right, for something like a Win with Black Women? What does that mean? I also will say, and we've had a plug for this group, Spill, really intentional around how we do the organizing, this is why it's also below the radar. And I appreciate what you're talking about with media, because you have to intentionally cut through the clutter. And so what's happening is when you are using your current social media platforms, and we know them all, the algorithms aren't designed to really facilitate that type of movement building that's needed, right? And so Spill is an alternative Black-owned platform that is continuing to scale so that we can organize our messaging in a way that controls for the biases built into the algorithms of our social media platforms. But there's a lot happening. They are at a local level, several of these efforts. I think what we're seeing on a national stage with disinvesting in corporations that are pulling out is important. The addition that's needing, though, is, well, what's the alternative, right? What do distribution channels look like for our Black businesses so that people can be conscious consumers? What are those alternatives? And so happy to share additional organizations that are doing some of that work, because it's important. They are very place-based, regional-based, but the platforms, and Spill is a really important one, it's really working on aggregating impact.
I'll just pick up on that point because, it's great that Melanie Campbell is here, Black Women's Roundtable, because Melanie, I think, really embodies some of what you were talking about and really trying to reward businesses that sort of said DEI is important, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but it makes good business sense. And also to push back against companies who pull back, right? Who, and showed that their commitment was, only an inch deep, if anything. So I do think there is something to working with lots of folks on the ground. I think part of this moment is, in addition to trying to devalue Black communities, it's also to create a narrative that we don't have power, but we actually do have power. We have economic power. And in those communities, it matters. Those companies that rely on Black folks to come in and buy stuff. If you say, I don't want to go there anymore because you are not committed to hiring me or, that type of thing, then, I think it incentivizes those companies to make the case. I'm investing for a variety of reasons, including it's important for my business model, right? So I do think there are partners probably in every place that League of Women Voters is. There's probably a community of folks that Janelle's talking about. I know there's Black Women's Roundtable. And there are lots of folks who I think can get together. And I think your point is well taken, that the political and the economic have to be part and parcel.
And just
Really
one
briefly.
name drop, you got to know, you probably are familiar with Derek Hamilton. He speaks eloquently on the Economic Bill of Rights. And so we do need to show what people deserve. We can articulate the civil rights because of our, our legal infrastructure, our history there. But there is a slate of economic rights that we also need to be familiar with. Derek Hamilton, he's great.
Last question here.
In fact, our civic rights are hollow without a set of economic rights to reinforce them. Yep. Double clicking on so much of what you all have said. One question I wanted to ask is around a recent New Yorker piece around like what we get wrong around the racial wealth gap. This piece, I think, is more so than the piece itself. It's indicative of a broad sentiment that I think when we talk about narrative, we should acknowledge is probably out there at this point where, there is a set of folks who feel like race-conscious solutions are off the table at this point, and that the pendulum has predictably swung the other direction, right? Like we go through these periods in history. I wanted to hear from you all, what are your lessons at this time, given, or like, how are you navigating this moment and bridging these issues as there seems to be a growing sentiment that being explicit about race is off the table?
Now, I'll just briefly say,
My name is Hope. I lead the Grow Fund. We do a guaranteed income program and a baby bonds program in Georgia. So like the tangibility of work, that really resonated.
Hope, I saw you, but when I heard you, I was like, wait, that's Hope. So good to see you. It's supposed to be on our panel too.
So I'd briefly love to hear each of your responses to that question.
well, I'm in that New Yorker article, so that he kind of gave me a critique, because I do believe you almost have to use race at some level to really determine the levels of investment that will lead to community uplift. From a research standpoint, there are proxies that we can use. I'm never afraid to be imaginative, to use data to get capital to the places that need it. But with that said, I'm looking at the larger goal here. They want the right to discriminate. That's the goal. To erode this infrastructure so they can say, I can give it to them under these conditions. They'll use class, they'll use whatever, they'll flip the script. And so for me, it's about understanding what their ultimate goal is. It's not, they could care less about race-conscious stuff. They want to have the right to discriminate. And so for me, I don't get too tied up in these discussions around the intricacies of certain civil rights policies. Those things are important and we can debate these things, but man, they do want this ability to say, I can give this rural white community a home and not this one. You know, and so I'm constantly reminding myself that's their goal there. But but this is an appetite for Black. There's a lot, many Black people, as you know, says race is not a factor anymore. It's about wealth. It's about income. It's about this and that. Right. And the data doesn't show that.
We have to wrap in just a couple of minutes, but briefly, I want to give the two of you a chance to respond.
I'll just say really quickly that I think it's even more important in this moment to talk about race, right? Like I think our problem is our refusal to acknowledge race's role in so many facets of our lives. So I think even in a moment when there's a real strong effort to try to pretend like race isn't an issue, it's even more important for us to double down on it. Whether you're talking across a variety of factors, I would say that. The last thing I would say is the legal, my legal training would say, yes, this is what the law requires and so forth. But, I think we have to remind ourselves that legal arguments don't win all the time, right? Like it took years to get to Brown. It takes years so that the moment that we're in is a terrible moment. We have a court that's going to rule bad. We're going to have lots of bad decisions. It doesn't mean that the way that we're arguing about the law is wrong. It means that we have to continue to make the arguments that we think work and are right and are appropriate. The very last thing I would say is that the status quo is inequitable, right? So the notion that some race consciousness for me is simply about trying to correct for flaws that were existing from the start, right? And I think we can't run from that reality and pretend like somehow we've come up with a status quo that works well. We do not have a meritocracy. That is not what this is about. So we have to be correcting it all the time.
I just want to say, please check out Georgia Resiliency Opportunity Fund. They're doing amazing work on baby bonds. Connect with Hope. Melanie is such an incredible example of doing national work and being community rooted. And so just so much respect for you, sisters. So much respect. Thank you. So 3 things. One is the data doesn't show that race neutral programs work. We know who the beneficiaries are. So if the invitation is to strip race, then you're actually saying not only perpetuate, but accelerate divides. So it just doesn't work. The second thing that I hold is when they say, let's strip race, what they really are trying to say is, let's strip racism. Let's pretend, let's negate that racism is real. And that's what they're running from. So my response has always been, and it will be as long as I'm leading Kindred Futures, we will continue to unapologetically focus on building collective Black wealth. We will be race explicit because we know there is a moral and economic imperative to end systemic racism. That is a reality. And so really holding those principles, knowing the data defends those principles, it is critical. And that's the invitation to invite value-aligned people to join and leverage our purchasing power, our political power collectively to hold accountability.
Well, thank you for this conversation. It was encouraging. Mm-hmm. I will say that it was encouraging. I'm going to turn things over to Laurel now.
I'm Laurel Atkinson. I'm the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at the Aspen Institute. And just to close this out, I just want to thank the panel and Jen for such a thoughtful conversation. I thought that was really amazing. At the Institute, we have a number of programs that are working to close the racial wealth gap, and we are hosting our very first ever Aspen Ideas Economy in October, the 20th and the 21st in Newark. So I want to just formally invite everyone to join us there. We'll talk about 3 things: home ownership, so we talked about that here today, retirement, and then the creator economy. So we really feel like narrative is extremely important. Who's telling stories, how those stories are being told. So we'll cover all of that at Aspen Ideas Economy in October. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.